Well, good morning to those of you on the West Coast of the United States, and good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. This is Casey Gwynn, and we're honored to have you join us for our monthly webinar of the National Family Justice Center Alliance. You will see on the screen the instructions for those of you that may be listening by audio and would like to log on. We do have a PowerPoint presentation for each webinar that we do each month, and that information is on the screen. You can end up listening through your webinar registration information on your computer, or you can dial in by phone, and that information as well is available on the screen. As we get started, we also want to note that you have the ability to send us questions as our presentation goes today, and you can type those questions in and send them in, and after our presenter today finishes his presentation, you will be able to then send those questions through, and Melissa Mack, our Director of Technical Assistance, and Jennifer Anderson on the team here at the National Family Justice Center Alliance will be providing those questions to me, and I'll be giving those questions to Ted as we get started. As I said, this is Casey Gwynn. I'm honored to be hosting this. I serve as the President of the National Family Justice Center Alliance, and along with Gail Strack, provide leadership to our team. We serve and support family justice centers around the United States and other kinds of co-located multi-agency models that serve victims of domestic violence and sexual assault and their children, with the goal of bringing together police officers and prosecutors and advocates and other kinds of services all under one roof so that victims can get all their services in one place. This webinar this month is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. We appreciate their support. Director Sue Carbon, Associate Director Susan Williams, and the whole team at OVW are doing just amazing work, not just with the police and prosecutor piece of VAWA, but with all the work that's done out of the Violence Against Women Office to support community-based organizations and others working to address domestic violence and sexual assault in the United States. And one of our grants of the Alliance includes support for these webinars each month that we provide free of charge. As we do these webinars, we always give a shout out to our team. We have more members on our team than that slide shows. We have about 14 staff members now, but these are our core staff that work on our national team. And on behalf of Gail Strack and myself, we always like to recognize them and the work that they're doing. Jennifer Anderson leads our initiative in California. Lori Gillum manages our office operations. Melissa Mack, who's on this call with me, is our Director of Technical Assistance and runs our conference every year, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Our conference this next year will be in New Orleans in April of 2012. And of course, Mary Mosini works with Melissa. Alexia runs our legal team at the San Diego Family Justice Center, and Jen is the newest member of our team and has been doing a lot of our administrative work and supports our kind of day-to-day operations. Just a few reminders about webinar information. Our webinars are all recorded. That webinar information is then provided to all those that are interested free through our resource library. The resource library is available at familyjusticecenter.org or familyjusticecenter.com. It is password protected, all of the resources that we have, thousands of documents and hundreds of webinars that are available for free. You need to become a member of the Alliance, which is also free, in order to access that information in the resource library. So you need to go to get involved, then become a member, and then once we review your information, which involves a name and an email address, you'll receive a notification and be able to access not only this webinar that Ted will be doing today, but any other webinar that we've been doing in recent years and will be doing in the future. Our presenter today is Ted Farley. We're so honored to have Ted join us. Ted's a staff attorney and the LGBTQ initiative coordinator for the Domestic Violence Project at the Urban Justice Center. He provides free legal representation for survivors of domestic violence living in the Bronx and really works to increase public awareness and outreach around the LGBTQ community. Ted has done a lot of public speaking, particularly in New York, around technology and violence in teen relationships and really the challenges for victims living with HIV and AIDS. In 2011, Ted was the recipient of the a Courage Award from the New York City Anti-Violence Project for excellence in serving the LGBTQ population. He received his JD from Brooklyn Law School and also served as an Edward Sparrow Public Interest Law Fellow there, and is licensed to practice law in the state of New York. I had the opportunity to meet Ted at Rutgers University this last year, where we were both presenting at a forum sponsored by Rutgers University School of Law, and I was so impressed with his passion and his heart and his just ability to dialogue on the topic and his knowledge about the challenges we face in this work that we've asked him to do this presentation today. So I want to welcome Ted Farley today, and we're going to turn over the controls to Ted and let him present today on our topic focused on how to provide services to the LGBT community in a family justice center. But knowing that we've got a lot of folks on this call who aren't part of family justice centers, it's still a great education for those of you that have not worked with the LGBT community or are not familiar with a lot of the challenges and issues they face in coming forward for help. So Ted, we're honored to have you join us this morning, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Casey. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon as the case is with me. My name is Ted Farley, as Casey said. I am the LGBTQ Initiative Coordinator with the Domestic Violence Project at the Urban Justice Center, and I actually sit at one of the Family Justice Centers located in the Bronx in New York. I want to thank Casey, I want to thank Melissa for helping to set this up, for reaching out to me, and everybody at the National Family Justice Center Alliance. As Casey said, I think the point of today's presentation is to get people familiar with the issues that might be facing the clients that we see who are affected by domestic violence and identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or any number of things. For any organizations that have not been trained or have not dealt with this population very much at all, this is purely an introduction. There are hours and hours and hours of training that can happen to make sure that when you deal with the LGBT population, you're working with the utmost competence. So that said, let's get started.
There will be a little bit of a delay, Ted, on your slides, but they'll come through there slowly over the internet.
Okay. So the presentation will proceed in a number of parts, and the first part is just going to be definitions. And I've started here with the LGBTQI community making sense of an endless acronym. Actually, I believe it's at Wesleyan University that their LGBT student group is actually titled Endless Acronym. That's because there are so many different ways in which people can identify, and it's important to that student group that nobody is necessarily left out. For the purpose of this presentation, I will mostly be referring to this community as LGBT only because that's easiest for me to say. So the first definition comes under lesbian. A lesbian is a woman attracted to women. Most important to recognize in this situation is that we are not able to tell by sight who is a lesbian, right? There is not one way to identify, and it is really up to the person to tell us either through the intake process or through surveys or forms that they fill out at the start of their meeting with us that they identify as a lesbian. You may hear people refer to lesbians who present more feminine than other as something like a lipstick lesbian. You may hear people refer to lesbian women who present as more masculine as butch. All of these terms are to come out from the person that you are interviewing who is identifying as such. Never a good idea when sitting in front of somebody who identifies as a lesbian and who you see is presenting as quite feminine to tell them that, oh, they are in fact a lipstick lesbian. That is something that could potentially make them feel uncomfortable if that's not a way that they identify. The next definition is gay. Often used to refer to men attracted to men, but also used colloquially as an umbrella term to include all lesbian and gay people. Not much here other than just to know that when somebody says they are gay, they could mean that they are also lesbian, right? So lesbians sometimes do refer to themselves as gay. You'll see in the media often that the LGBT community can sometimes often just be referred to as the gay community. Quite frankly, referring to the entire LGBT community as the gay community might be leaving a certain number of people out. So it is important that when you refer to them as a group, really the correct term to remember is LGBT or LGBTQ, as you see in the title of my job position, actually. Okay, our next definition is bisexual, and this is a person who is attracted to two sexes or two genders, but not necessarily simultaneously or equally. Traditionally, bisexual people are defined as having erotic, affectionate, romantic feelings for, fantasies of, and experiences with women and men and/or who self-identify as bisexual. Okay, that's a lot of words. And really, to break it down, what it means is that bisexual people are attracted to both genders. And that first sentence, saying not necessarily simultaneously or equally, is very important. People who identify as bisexual, I think, quite frankly, are just acknowledging that for them, their sexuality exists on somewhat of a spectrum. When they say they're bisexual, they're not saying that they are attracted to women as much as they are attracted to men. They're just acknowledging that that desire for both genders refers to them. What is also important to remember in this is that somebody who identifies as bisexual may not have had any experiences with one gender in particular, right? So it could be a married woman, for example, who's married to a man who is having some difficulty because she's having feelings towards women, and she can't really figure it out. That would be somebody who may identify as bisexual, and who maybe could benefit from some of the resources available through LGBT organizations. Transgender, that's our next definition. And transgender people are those whose psychological selves differ from the social expectations for the physical sex they were born with. One example would be a female with a masculine gender identity who identifies as a man. Transgender is not a sexual orientation. Transgender people may have any sexual orientation. So when we talk about transgender, the key aspect of that word is gender, right? And gender is a social construct when we speak about it in these terms, meaning that somebody who is transgender could potentially be a woman who was born with female sex organs, but at some point in that person's life, they start to feel very uncomfortable about their sex organs because for them, they are male. In their identity is male, and their identity, in the form of that social construct does not comport with their biological sex organs. That's what we're talking about when we speak about transgender people. Something also to realize is that you may, as a service provider, be sitting with somebody who looks female, presents as female, and their gender orientation could be male. Transgender people do not have to be presenting as the gender that is opposite of their biological sex in order to be transgender. And that, I think, is something that's very important to realize because it is all about allowing these, it is all about allowing the person to self-identify, right? Allowing them the freedom to feel that they can talk about who they actually are. And when we are in this context, right, when we're working at family justice centers or when we're working with victims of domestic violence, that opportunity, right, and that ability to feel free to disclose just about anything is so important because we know that the more somebody is comfortable and the more they feel they are able to disclose to us, the more we are able to find out about their given situation, the potential dangers that they're facing, and it increases our ability to help them stay safe. And really, that's, at the front of our priorities as far as is concerned. So with transgender individuals who, may be presenting as a gender that they don't identify with, it's very important to allow them the freedom to tell us who they are. Queer. Queer is a simple label to explain a complex set of behaviors and desires related to sexual orientation or gender identities. For example, a person who is attracted to multiple genders may identify as queer. So what I say when I speak about somebody who is identifying as queer is that what it comes from is in the past, 10, 20, 30 years, as gay and lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people have felt more comfortable coming out, and as the public in general has seen more examples of gay and lesbian people, there have sort of been these stereotypes that have formed, right? So we were confronted with gay people on Will and Grace and a number of other television shows. Ellen DeGeneres came out of the closet, and as a result, right, stereotypes began to form because of these images of gay and lesbian people that the media was putting out to us, that we were reading about, that we were seeing and everything, from the news to IKEA commercials. People who identify as queer a lot of the time don't necessarily want those labels thrust upon themselves. They feel sometimes that being identified as gay is perhaps too much of a label that does not necessarily fit them. So identifying as queer allows them the freedom to say, I'm not necessarily straight, and I don't want, to be judged because of that. But I also don't like that label that's associated with gay or lesbian, and I feel more that I'm queer because that's where my identity rests. Questioning. Now, when we refer to the LGBTQ community, that Q is sort of interchangeable with queer and questioning. So sometimes if you ask people what LGBTQ stands for, they'll replace that Q with questioning when, for my terms of my job title, I refer to it as queer. Questioning is a term that can refer to a person who is questioning their gender, sexual identity, or sexual orientation. People who are questioning may be unsure of their sexuality or still exploring their feelings. In the work that I do, what I feel is the best, not the best, but the benefit of this, of having this questioning identity and informing the people who are going to be working with, populations on a large scale as to what questioning means, is the fact that the idea of questioning as an identity is allowing people who perhaps in the past might not have felt comfortable talking about the fact that they are having feelings, that are not necessarily in line with our social constructs or of what society tells us is right. It's allowing these people who are having these feelings to explore somewhat, and they may be exploring by reaching out to resources that can really offer them a lot of help. They may be exploring by talking to people who they know who are LGBT, and who, it's sort of for that crowd of people. I don't know if anybody out there is familiar with the It Gets Better video or the It Gets Better YouTube campaign, where LGBT folks and, straight people who are allies of the LGBT community tell youth who are having feelings that they may be gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender, that they can explore these feelings, and they can in fact be out of the closet, and it does get better. A lot of those populations are questioning youth, and I think it's important to acknowledge that people in their middle ages can also begin to question their own sexuality. They may not feel that they're at the point in their lives at that point in time that they can identify with a particular sexual orientation or gender identity, and so questioning is really what fits them. Intersex. Now, intersex, whereas transgender are dealt with the social construct of gender, intersex is a set of medical conditions that feature congenital anomaly of the reproductive and sexual system. That is, intersex people are born with sex chromosomes, external genitalia, or internal reproductive systems that are not considered standard for either males or females. The term intersex is a biological term, whereas the term transgender is one that has to do with social constructs. People who are intersex are born with either sex chromosomes that make them not necessarily the male sex or not necessarily the female sex. or external genitalia that does not comport with their internal reproductive system. What had been traditionally the case with people who had been born intersex was that at birth the decision would be made either by the doctors or by parents to do a procedure that would make them one sex or another. What is becoming more common, still not very common, is allowing the child who is born intersex to grow up a little bit and start to, display character traits that are more or less consistent with the gender that they may prefer to be. It's a very delicate process. It is done with a lot of oversight and a lot of professional opinion and a lot of resources made available to these people, but it is something that is happening rather than what used to happen, which was assigning the child a sex at birth. Okay, so now that we've taken a stab at defining that endless acronym, let's move into talking about domestic violence in the LGBT community. And section 1 of this part is that domestic violence in the LGBT community actually happens. We as practitioners, we as service providers, may not see that many LGBT clients coming into our centers. We may not see them coming into court so often, but we do know that it happens. So I've looked for a few examples. In February 2010, Nicole Cheminsky was convicted of setting fire to her ex-girlfriend's home, killing 2 of her ex-girlfriend's children. Friends reported that the couple had publicly argued at a wedding on the night the fire was set. In April of 2011, James Costello was arrested and charged with the murder of his partner, David Walton. In July of 2011, John LaCoy stabbed and killed his boyfriend after the two had an argument. LaCoy then buried the body beneath the couple's home before calling a friend and reporting that the victim had drowned in a nearby beach. And currently, the alleged murder of Anna Marie Rintala is under investigation after her body was found in the basement of the home she shared with her wife, Carla Rintala. Carla had been arrested in 2008 for punching Anna Marie in the back of the head. Surveys consistently show us that domestic violence happens at an equivalent rate amongst all couples regardless of sexual orientation. Statistics report that anywhere from 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 individuals in same-sex relationships experience violence at the hands of an abusive partner during their lifetime. Now, this is interesting because that 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 statistic is virtually identical to the statistic that we see in heterosexual relationships. And yet we are not seeing, right, the amount of people who identify as LGBT coming through the doors of our resource centers in a way that reflects that statistic rather. So why? If we know that it's happening everywhere, why don't we hear about it? Now, the first reason why I posit and why several people posit, I should pause for a moment and say that, of course, I have been to many trainings on this topic myself. A lot of the information that I'm presenting today has been presented before by people from the National Center for Anti-Violence Projects, or National Coalition of Anti-Violence Projects, by a wonderful organization in Seattle, I believe it is, called the Northwest Network, and a number of other nonprofit organizations and community-based organizations that are working to help people to recognize that domestic violence is a big problem in the LGBT community, and it is something that we should be paying more attention to, and it is something that we should really start including in all of our conversations on domestic violence, because only then might we see more people coming forward. So the first reason I have here for why we might not hear about it is that people in same-sex relationships who experience domestic violence may not report it. And the question I ask here is, what type of messages about same-sex relationships are sent to the LGBT community? And this is not a political conversation. This is not a political statement. But, the fact is that throughout the country, laws exist in our state constitution, laws exist in our federal constitution that say that if the relationship is between anyone other than a man and a woman, it is not worthy of legal recognition, right? And if it is within relationships that domestic violence exists, and if it is within these relationships that we are typically and traditionally thought to think that domestic violence could be a problem, what we're doing is essentially sending the message that domestic violence exists in legitimate relationships. Therefore, people who are in relationships that are taught or, that society may deem as not necessarily legitimate or worthy of recognition might get the message that domestic violence can't even affect them. Domestic violence, they might think, is a heterosexual straight woman's problem. And we all know, and many of us know, that quite frankly is not true. Also, language makes a difference. And for this, again, we think about terms like family court and terms like battered women that are put in place with, of course, the best intentions and with only the, idea of trying to help as many people as possible. But with a term like family court, LGBT people are often told that what they have does not constitute a family. They may be prevented from adopting their partner's child because of laws that are in existence. They may be prevented from adopting children in general because of laws that are in existence. And so how can they form a family? And then we go and tell this same set of people that in order to obtain a civil order of protection if they're experiencing domestic violence, they should go to family court. So when we're working with clients and when we're seeing that they experience these things and that they really don't know where to turn to for help, it's important that we recognize that those things that are most obvious to many people might not be obvious to them. This family court language being an example. We should also consider how comfortable they may feel going to some place that is actually called family court. So there might be some talking through that we need to do with them about what family court actually is, the fact that you can obtain a civil order of protection or a restraining order there, and what it's going to look like, to sort of take the mystery out of it, or to sort of take the label out of it that it's going to be filled with people in child custody battles or the like. The term battered women or battered woman obviously it leaves out for those who are affected by domestic violence who may be male and in a same-sex relationship. If that's the term that they are met with, if the legal service provider in their area, is called the Battered Women's Legal Services Center, which is quite, often the case, they may not feel that they can go there for help. So if you are working at a place like that, it may be an important step to take to make sure that your organization is reaching out and letting people know that you are able to serve all people regardless of sex or gender or sexual orientation. I kind of touched on this point earlier, and that's, do they know that domestic violence can happen to them? They may not consider that domestic violence can happen to them if they are not in a heterosexual relationship. And that's because domestic violence has this very gendered dynamic to it, right? Those power and control dynamics come from what some people say, is the, discrepancy that society prescribes between male and female, and that power dynamic that exists there lends itself to domestic violence in our intimate relationships. Well, when we take relationships out of that, heterosexual model, right, and out of that gendered model, what does it look like? And then the last thing is, who can they tell? This problem is faced by everybody, right? And a lot of these problems are faced by people in heterosexual relationships as well. A lot of the issues that I'll be talking about throughout this presentation are of course, faced by heterosexual people as well. But if you're LGBT, and you may not be publicly LGBT to very many people other than your partner, who can you tell? If you're living in an area that you are well aware is not very hospitable to the LGBT population, do you feel that there are resources within your community that you can go to and get help from? if getting help requires for you to say that you're in a same-sex relationship, or if getting help requires you to say that you're transgender. So what that really does is it puts the impetus upon us as service providers to be doing outreach, so that when that question comes up of who can I tell, they're able to locate those resources. All right, so building on that, if it happens, why don't we hear about it? Is that it's not one reason may be that it may not be reported as domestic violence by law enforcement. And that's the traditional assumption that a fight between two men is just that, a fight, not domestic violence. Or a fight between two women is a cat fight, not domestic violence. Again, this is building off the fact that if law enforcement responds to an argument between two men that has turned violent, there may not even be a conscious thought that this could perhaps be an example of domestic violence, right? That might not even cross their mind. It might just be a fight, or it is just a fight. Because the idea that two men could be living together in a relationship in which there's this, power dynamic that leads to a number of problems and perhaps danger for one person doesn't necessarily cross their mind, and that again indicates the need for training and the inclusion of the LGBT community in all of the conversations that we have about domestic violence. Same thing goes for a fight between two women. It's sort of whether it's between two women or two men. It's this thought that when people are more equally matched in size and shape, or if the relationship is not between a man and a woman, that this couldn't, in fact, possibly be domestic violence. So as such, it's sometimes not reported as domestic violence when, in fact, it is. Also, think about those same situations where police are responding to that violent incident between a man and a woman, between a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, and realize that at that point in time, it may be up to either the victim or the abuser in that circumstance to self-identify to a law enforcement official that they are gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender. And until they actually take that step of outing themselves to that law enforcement official, that situation is not going to be deemed domestic violence, but instead just a fight. And then think about how comfortable that might be for them and what they feel they might experience if they, at that point in time, decide to disclose their sexual orientation and gender identity to that law officer. And, while all of us know that law enforcement officials are as well-intentioned as possible, given the LGBT person's experiences with society and with law enforcement at that point in time, think about how safe they might feel revealing that to somebody. So that's another reason why an incident between two people of the same sex might not be reported as domestic violence. Also, I mentioned earlier, the fact that because the people are of the same sex, they're going to have more of, there's going to be less of a discrepancy in size and strength traditionally. Now, that gives a difficulty with primary aggressor analysis. Primary aggressor analysis being the analysis that somebody responding to a domestic violence incident is going to do in order to determine, who perhaps should be arrested during that given incident or after that given incident. We are informed by our experiences that if you're responding to a domestic violence call and it's a heterosexual couple, that most often the case is going to be that the male in the situation is the primary aggressor. Well, what happens when you take that, sex discrepancy out of that situation or gender discrepancy out of that situation? That analysis becomes a lot more difficult. And finally, if it happens, why don't we hear about it? Well, it's not reported as domestic violence in the media. So I reported on fatalities at the beginning of this section, right? When I talked about those 4 examples of people who had been killed by their same-sex partner or who had lost children because their same-sex partner had been violent. All of those incidents, those fatalities that I cited, happened in one state. That's Massachusetts. And what does that say? That says that Massachusetts is identifying this as an issue. And Massachusetts is labeling these areas, in some ways it is, labeling these incidents that happen between two people of the same sex as domestic violence, right? But is any other state? Massachusetts also was the first state in our country to recognize same-sex marriages between two people, so it should follow that, you know, they recognize these relationships as very similar to heterosexual relationships. And following that, just like they're similar to heterosexual relationships, they're similar to sexual relationships in that they can become violent. But what we see in other states, and probably continued in Massachusetts, is that incidents that happen between people of the same sex are not necessarily reported as domestic violence within the media. There have been murders in New York City, where I live, a very, very, very progressive place, that are just reported as murders. A man's roommate killed him in the Hell's Kitchen area of New York City. That person was called a roommate by everybody from the Daily News to the New York Times and never identified as the person's romantic partner. Now, it's the media that sends us these messages. It's the media that has the broadest reach, right, over us generally. So if we're not receiving these messages from the sector of our society that has the greatest capacity to communicate to us what problems actually exist, it makes sense that we don't know that the problem actually exists, right? So these incidents need to start being labeled domestic violence when they're reported, because we know they're happening. And until they start being labeled correctly, we're not going to know the extent to which they exist, other than in those surveys that report that they exist on the equivalent level with heterosexual relationships. So if domestic violence is about the dynamics of power and control, we have to remember that those dynamics can exist between people of the same sex. Just because two people may be more equally matched in size and strength does not mean one cannot manifest control over the other. And we know this. We know this as domestic violence service providers when we do virtually any analysis of any client's given situation. We generally, as a matter of fact, try and take, you know, those very stereotypical aspects out of it so that we can perform a proper assessment of the relationship to determine the dynamics of power and control exist. When we're dealing with people of the same sex, we really do have to make sure that we remember that those dynamics of power and control can manifest themselves in ways, you know, far more many ways than just physical exertion of strength. So when domestic violence does happen in the LGBT community, what does it look like? Does it look like just like it does in the heterosexual community? For the most part, yes. There are many similarities to domestic violence in heterosexual relationships. Those similarities include, but of course are not limited to, victims are often blamed for the abusers by partners, and sometimes even family, friends, and professionals can excuse or minimize the abusive behavior. It's difficult for victims to leave abusive relationships. Abuse usually worsens over time, and the abuser is often apologetic after abusing, given false hope that the abuse will stop. So like I said earlier, there are many problems faced by people in heterosexual relationships that are also faced by those in LGBT relationships where domestic violence exists, and this is one of them. So how might domestic violence in an LGBT relationship differ? What are those things that people who identify as LGBT and who are victims of domestic violence might be facing that people in heterosexual relationships might not be facing? And it's important that we think about these because as service providers, we are constantly safety planning. We are constantly doing an analysis of the person's situation to see how best we can help them. And so we should be aware, if we're meeting with somebody who's LGBT, of how their situation could potentially differ. So the first thing is the threat of outing as a control tactic. So to start, just defining the term outing. Before a person identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer, and before they perhaps even admit it to themselves, we're all, or many of us may be familiar with the term that they are in the closet. The practice, the idea of coming out, or is the idea that somebody is then disclosing themselves to others that they are LGBTQ. And the threat of outing is the idea that somebody other than that person, who may at the time be closeted or may be out only to a small group of people, so somebody other than that person is going to tell others that they are LGBTQ. So it's that process of somebody in a domestic violence relationship who is closeted to all of their family members or who is not out at work. A wonderful way to exercise control over that person is to say, oh, you're thinking of leaving me? You're thinking you have it bad? Well, your mom doesn't know you're gay, and I'm going to tell her. Your mom doesn't know you're a lesbian. Your sister doesn't know, and they will drop you like a bad habit the second that I tell them, and all I have to do is pick up that phone and make one phone call. The other thing is, do you want to leave me? I know where you work. What do you think they're going to think? How do you think you're going to be treated on a daily basis when I go to them and I tell them that I'm your partner of 6 years? What do you think? How do you think things are going to change for them? So that is a very, very powerful control tactic. It reminds me of many of my clients who may be undocumented and don't have status here in the country, whose abusers have kept them in relationships by saying, if you leave me, I'll report you to immigration, and I'll have you deported immediately, and you'll leave your children. It's that idea of losing your support system, right? It's dangling that carrot of, I can do this, and you will lose all of your support system, or you will lose your job. Your life will change completely in a way that you don't want to if I do this thing as simple as just telling people that you're gay or lesbian or transgender. Also, very limited services exist for specifically for abused and abusive LGBT people. As I stated, I work in New York City. And in New York City, of all the beds in domestic violence shelters, I believe only 2 are reserved for people who specifically want beds that are reserved for LGBT individuals. There's a significantly small amount of beds that exist for anybody who identifies as male in domestic violence shelters in my city in New York. And so what that does is that limits the safety resources available to our either male-identified transgender people or the male, gay, and bisexual people who are experiencing domestic violence at the hands of a same-sex partner. Those shelter resources, I think many of us who are domestic violence service providers realize, are quite often, the best way for our clients to get safe and to get out of that cycle of domestic violence. And for a lot of people in the LGBT community, that option just doesn't exist. Also, shelters for abused women may not be sensitive to same-sex abuse. Theoretically, shelters are open to all women, and therefore a same-sex victim may not feel safe, as her abuser may also have access to the shelter. And abused gay and trans men have even fewer places to turn for help, in that there are no agency-sponsored safe places to stay. So really what that is let's say you are a woman who identifies as female and you're in a same-sex relationship and you have the opportunity to go into shelter. Well, you might be a little bit reticent to do so, not just for the traditional reasons that our clients are reticent to go into shelter, right, and the inconveniences that they face by leaving their home and their kids having to change schools and all that kind of thing, but also because of their experiences in the past. How do they feel? They are going to be treated when they have to go to that shelter and sit in group and tell a group of women that they don't know that they're in a same-sex relationship. That's just one more hurdle that they're going to have to overcome before they make that decision to really get themselves safe and go to shelter. And that also, quite frankly, is one way that they may be made to feel uncomfortable in the shelter that they're in. Okay, I'm going to briefly go through some examples of some case examples, clients that I have had who are in situations where they're in a same-sex relationship and they are experiencing domestic violence. Now, TG is an excellent example of the control that one can wield when they threaten to out somebody, and an excellent example of the consequences that being outed can have. TG lived with his partner of 8 years. For about 5 years, they were living together in his partner's home with his partner's family. And for the entirety of their relationship, they kept their relationship a secret to his partner's entire family, right? So despite the fact that they were sharing a room and living in the same house as the family did not know that they were in an intimate relationship together. The relationship became abusive. TG was being hit on basically a daily basis by his partner. And when he threatened to take action, when he threatened to try and obtain an order of protection or to reach out for help, his partner went ahead and told everybody in his family and everybody in TG's home, that is, that he was gay, that TG was gay. His partner maintained that he was straight and TG was gay. And as a result, after he was outed, TG was not just abused by his partner on a daily basis, but the male members of TG's family also beat up on him, and TG was harassed by the rest of the people in his household as well. TG was 25 in New York City. I don't know if it's the same throughout the country. That means he was a year too old for youth services, which end at 24, and for youth shelters, which do not allow people in who are over 24. And he had to leave the house for his safety. There were no beds available in domestic violence shelters, and he was essentially rendered homeless because of what had happened to him. I will move on. Actually, I will skip ER for a second because we have talked about that problem with primary aggressor analysis, and that's what that example is about. But JB was a client of mine, and the situation in that case was when I did the initial assessment, I remember thinking this is exactly what I learned about when I was in law school, was textbook, domestic violence. JB's situation hit every single bullet point on that list of what a person who is a victim of domestic violence may be experiencing. You saw the cycle of violence. You saw the apologies after the huge incidents. You saw the honeymoon period. And we worked with JB for a long time. We worked on a lengthy motion for him, and before getting to file that motion, we contacted him to make sure that, putting his partner on notice that we had filed something in court would not make him less safe. And he said, "Oh, I'll come in." And he came in, and he came in with his partner, and they were back together. And thinking about that was really just, I identified this as textbook in the first place, and in the ways that we don't like it to be, it's textbook yet again. So when I say that these situations look very much like they do in heterosexual relationships, I mean it. They mean it. They look like it in virtually every aspect. So for a lot of the people who are listening in on this call, you may not have had the opportunity to deal with LGBT clients in your practice or in the work that you do. And the idea that people may be coming into your into your organization or into your centers who are identifying as LGBT and need help, for some, I recognize could be a little bit difficult. If you don't have any experience, if you don't know a gay person or a lesbian person or a bisexual or transgender person, you've not had any experience. And so perhaps there's a little bit of perspective we can get on, how should we feel about helping LGBT folks? And I really tried to put it into some sort of perspective. I don't know how successful I was. The first thing I thought of was, if we allowed our own judgment of our client's choice and partner to impact the level of service we provide, we would probably be significantly less helpful, right? So if our problem with let's say somebody has a problem with serving an LGBT person, that problem is essentially because we don't like who that person has decided to be an intimate partner with. If we ever use that in our regular practice of helping heterosexual clients, as a method of determining how much help this person deserves, we would be so much less helpful. The other person in the relationship is not important to us, regardless of gender or sexual orientation or whatever. In most cases, the other person in the relationship who has victimized our client, who has made our client take on that label of survivor because what they have gotten through after they have suffered, is a terrible person. The person who matters is our client. The person who is suffering is our client, and we are here to help them. And the other thing I thought of was is that the focus should be on providing high-quality services to those in need. The focus should not be on who those in need are falling in love with, right? So as an example, there are times when we have clients who come in, they have had abusive partners. They may be female, right? Here's an example. A woman comes in, she is female identified, and she has children with a man who has been abusive to her for many years, and who she left maybe 2 years ago, and there's a custody battle going on. These are things that in my practice as an attorney in family court I deal with regularly. That woman may now perhaps identify as a lesbian, and she might have a female partner. That is not necessarily any of our business. That aspect of her being LGBT should not affect the way in which we serve her. And the example, the fact that she is in a new relationship and has fallen in love again would not impact the way we served her if she was straight, and should not, in fact, impact the way we serve her now because we know that she is in a same-sex relationship. So as DV advocates, we already know that there are things about our clients that we can help with, and there are things that are none of our business. If I fully respect that there may be differences in people's belief systems, and there may be beliefs that don't necessarily comport with acceptance of LGBT relationships in some way, shapes, or form. I respect that we can hold these beliefs. But I also respect that we are professionals and that we have a responsibility to do our job to the best of our ability, especially as DV advocates. We're dealing with people in a state of crisis. And there are times when those certain aspects of a client's personal life are not relevant to the services that we can provide them. What is relevant is remembering that because people may identify as LGBT, that there are going to be different situations that they are facing that we need to take into account when we do help them. So speaking with LGBT clients, when they come into our centers, when they come in seeking services, what's the best way to address them? So this is something to consider for everybody who is listening in terms of what do your assessment instruments look like. Do they have appropriate questions and answers for LGBT folks? In New York State recently made legal same-sex marriages between same-sex partners. And for those first few days when people were able to register their marriage and register, for a marriage license in the state, you could go online. And the form online said, wife's name and husband's name, or something to that effect, right? Name of the man, name of the woman. And this was even in a state that had just legalized same-sex marriage. They had not yet amended their forms to be culturally appropriate, or to even be correct for a state that had just legalized same-sex marriage. Think about the forms that your clients use. Right? So, are they asking for the person to list the name of their partner, or are they asking for the person to list the name of their husband? And how might that make somebody feel if they come in, if that first step that they take through the door, they're given a form to fill out, and that abusive partner space makes them feel a little bit like they don't belong there. This is somebody who has taken that very important, very rare first step towards getting help. And then the idea that we could put them off initially just by the form that we give them, despite our best intentions to help, could be, could really make them close off and closing off is a person who is closed off is a person who we're not going to be able to help to the best of our ability. Use sensitive and direct questions and standardize your questions. Make it matter of fact. So if we're asking somebody, do you identify with a sexual orientation? What gender do you identify as? Do you identify with a gender? If we ask that as matter of fact, right? If we ask that with this is a normal question, this is what I'm asking you, that's perhaps the best way to ask the question, right? If we're saying, do you identify with a particular sexual orientation? That's an awkward way to ask a question. That person's going to be made to feel awkward. So the more matter-of-fact we are about anything, right? I mean, this happens when we ask about a client's sex life, if that's relevant to what's happening. Making it matter-of-fact makes somebody feel more comfortable and feel more able to disclose. Standardizing questions enables you to have a discussion with your organization as to the best way to ask these questions. If you don't know, if you want to change your assessment instruments, if you want to change your intake weight, and you don't necessarily know how to ask the questions, reach out to LGBT organizations that are in your community. If there's not an LGBT organization in your community, for when domestic violence is concerned, I would recommend the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Projects. They are exceptional at what they do, and they will provide you with some guidance as to places near you that could help you in learning how to deal with helping LGBT people in a culturally sensitive manner. The other thing is, don't assume that one of your clients is out. Ask them if they are out, right? So you could have the most effeminate person or a person who comes in there and identifies as female, but looks incredibly masculine. It is never appropriate to assume that that person is lesbian or gay and that they are, in fact, out as lesbian or gay. If the person has already identified that they are in a relationship with somebody of the same sex, and they are out to you in that manner, don't also assume that they're out to everybody else in their life, right? So the question is, so if somebody has identified to us, somebody has come in and they've identified to us that they're in a relationship with somebody of the same sex, the question to ask is, who knows about your life and relationships? Where else are you comfortable or safe to share this information? That allows us to figure out what this person might be facing when they leave this relationship, right? Who knows? Who knows about your life and relationships? What's that helping us do? That's helping us to figure out safety resources for that client. Where else are you comfortable or safe to share this information? That's allowing us to identify even more safe, right? So mom might know about your life and your relationships, but mom might not be comfortable, and it might not be safe to share the information with her, right? So when we're thinking of places this client can go for safety, if they need to get out of their current household because it's dangerous, these questions can really help us. A note about the transgender community and about sort of outing with that is that it's the level of danger associated with coming out as a transgender individual. One, when you're in an intimate relationship with somebody, and two, in general, there's a tremendous amount of what's called transphobia. And for that, what we have found with people in relationships who identify as transgender is that outing control tactic is almost exponentially stronger. And also because they've been taught from the beginning that what was biologically, theirs and what was theirs as far as their gender is not right, right? That idea of not being right. They may also feel that because they're in an intimate relationship, finally, they've found somebody who loves them. And despite the fact that they're being hurt on a daily basis, where else are they going to find somebody who accepts them? So the barriers to leaving for transgender people, just as an aside, are tremendous. Finally, assessing the client and primary aggressor analysis. I just want to touch on this. And I did talk about this a little bit earlier. When domestic violence occurs in heterosexual relationships, the female is the victim 95% of the time. And while this information does not create work environments and should not create work environments that assume women to be victims and men to be batterers, it certainly informs the way we do our job on a daily basis. So what do we do when the couple is one of the same sex? Well, first we kind of need to really just check our assumptions about what a normal relationship is. For some people listening, we might not assume this to be a normal relationship, and we might not really have any context in which to think about it. I would recommend reaching out to your supervisors for help in that situation. I would recommend feeling very comfortable to have a frank conversation about the fact that you may not feel comfortable dealing with a person who is LGBT. And why is that? That's because we want to provide our services to the best of our ability. And if we realize that we are limited in our ability, we don't want to half help somebody. We don't want to keep them kind of safe. And so if you recognize within yourself that you are uncomfortable, that's an important thing to recognize. And it is something that you should reach out for help with, and that you should identify perhaps outside of your organization places where you can refer clients if your organization is not equipped, because these are, like I said, people who are in crisis and people who need help, sometimes immediately. And take stock and assess your own biases, which may contribute to perceptions of the situation, right? So it's a same-sex relationship, but we may, based upon our experience of domestic violence as a gender dynamic, assume that in a lesbian relationship, the person who presents as more masculine is the abuser. And that's not necessarily what we should do in the situation. We should assess the situation fully, right? So we should think about the context in which that behavior occurred. So was there violence, right? Well, how did that violence happen? We do this in virtually every assessment of a domestic violence victim, right? Was that scratch that happened on the person, was it a defensive scratch, or was it a scratch that was meant to hurt and to establish some dynamic of control? That goes both to the context and to the motivation and the impact on each person's life. Whose life gets smaller, right? That person who is only out to their abuser and feels as though they can't tell anybody else, and that the abuser is the only person in this universe who is going to love them because they've been taught perhaps to hate themselves because they are LGBT. Is their life going to get infinitely smaller when they realize that the person that they're with, whom they love very much, is abusive towards them? Of course. Is their life going to get smaller when the person who is abusive towards them tells them, I know you're not out to these people, I know you're not out at work, I'm going to tell them if you leave me. That makes your life infinitely smaller. And finally, just some notes on safety planning before I take questions, and this will just take 2 minutes. And this goes along the lines of when things are different, right, from heterosexual relationships. And a lot of this comes from because LGBT people may not be out of the closet. So ask about problems that they may have faced due to their sexual orientation and gender identity. Figure out if they are open about their sexual orientation and find out where they are out and to whom. Identify possible areas where they may have support, family, chosen family, friendship, right? So if they tell you that they've experienced hate violence in their neighborhood, or if they tell you that they've experienced hate violence in a friend's neighborhood, we may not recommend that they go to visit their friend, right? If they tell you that they have had problems with the police because the police know that they're trans, and the police harass them, the police in their neighborhood harass them because of it, if you work at a family justice center where you have a police officer on site, you may recommend that they make reports to that police officer. You may do some advocacy around that issue with the police department to say that you've been made aware that somebody in their neighborhood is being discriminated against, and that person really needs their help. And then also, as far as, see what their resources are as far as safety is concerned. Recommend LGBT service organizations for them to explore. Realize that despite the fact that you might think it's within their best interest to disclose their identities to certain people, that's their decision to make. And respect their confidentiality. If they have chosen to tell you about their sexual orientation or their sexual identity, do not assume that it is okay for you to tell other people. Respect the fact that they felt good enough with you to tell you that, and that you did your job in allowing them to disclose. And discuss the potential benefits and risks of disclosure and interactions with the police medical system, criminal justice system, and service providers. And again, I think we sort of covered this when we talked about if you're calling the police and it's a domestic violence incident, do you feel comfortable telling them that it's a domestic violence incident because that person of the same sex is your romantic partner? And it's things of that nature. And just one note on creating an inclusive environment, because it's the one that I think is most important. People look for symbols that it's going to be okay to disclose their sexual orientation or sexual or gender identity. They look for signage. They look for things that make them feel comfortable. And so I cannot express the importance of making your workspace obviously open to diverse orientations and identities. Even from a personal perspective, the difference that a rainbow flag being up in somebody's office might make. That rainbow flag, they make very cheap stickers that you can put up on your wall, and because you have one up in your office, doesn't necessarily mean that you too are identifying as LGBT. It is creating an environment in your office that tells people this is a safe place for you to disclose, so long as it is a safe place for them to disclose. And the other thing that could be, if you don't like that idea of the rainbow flag, some sort of statement, right? So a poster with a very short quote from somebody that expresses the idea of tolerance of all identities and orientations. Something like that can make all the difference in the world. Because when people come in and, are feeling relatively uncomfortable, they're looking for everything, including visual cues, to make them more comfortable. And I really cannot express enough the significance of this type of visual cue and how much it will help to allow people to feel comfortable. All right. And it's about an hour, and I think I'm ready for questions.
That's great, Ted. Well, thank you very much. Excellent presentation and just really good information. We've got a whole bunch of questions, so I'll just jump into them and
Sure.
kind of move through them. A number of questions around this issue of shelter. The number of questions around shelters that do serve only women but know that they're serving lesbian women as well, and questions about how to make sure that the abuser's partner doesn't end up in the same shelter with the victim in same-sex relationships. There are a number of questions from shelter directors about that, if you want to kind of comment on that. There are a number of questions around the incredible need for shelters for men, for gay men, which are not generally available around the country.
Okay. Shelter is a huge issue, and I think I talked a little bit about the fact that it is really the safest option for a lot of our people who are experiencing this problem. With regard to domestic violence shelters for women, right, it's a situation where a lesbian woman is going to wind up in the same shelter as her abusive partner. Goodness, that seems like a terrible problem, and I think what the root of that problem is that primary aggressor analysis, right? And so if this has become not necessarily a regular problem, but something that has happened on more than one occasion for your particular shelter, I would recommend really reaching out to an LGBT organization in Southern California, in Los Angeles. The LGBT Center have people who specialize in this type of thing. I mentioned the Northwest Network in Seattle and the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Projects, which includes, many LGBT-focused organizations that deal with violence in the LGBT community. And why I recommend reaching out to those people is because they will have perhaps the most experience in conducting primary aggressor analysis, in really looking at the context of a situation, so that if you're faced with two women, given this example, if you're faced with two women in the same relationship, both claiming to be the victim, you can really do an in-depth analysis that gets at the context of the behaviors. Where is that imbalance of power and control? Is this domestic violence? Or is this a mutually combative relationship in which we have two violent people? And then, the situation becomes, if you do have two women who are in a relationship and wind up in the same DV shelter, do you have the resources available, and do you have an understanding community of other shelter providers that will take referrals so that you can perhaps, get them out of being in the same shelter. Mm-hmm. For men, I know that there are task forces throughout the country that are focused on getting these shelters set up, even just shelter beds available for gay men who are experiencing domestic violence. I also have had clients who have had tremendous difficulty in finding safe places to stay because of the lack of shelter beds. Mm-hmm. So it is definitely a pressing need. But what is more so is, what comes first, right? Do we provide, we know now that there's a dearth of beds available, but we also know that a number of people are not coming forward. So do we have the resources? Do we have we created or been able to show a demonstrable need enough that, people are going to start putting up money for these shelters to be built? Or, have we not created an environment in every other service provider area that is comfortable enough to allow people to disclose that they are in domestic violence? And it's our fact that we've not created this environment, that the media is not discussing TV in this context, really, not helping us to display the way we need to display when we do grant proposals and everything like that, that there's a need for these shelters.
Mm-hmm. There's a number of questions around communities you may be aware of that you would say have a strong coordinated community response around LGBT community issues. If you know of particular places, particularly in terms of the criminal justice system, because there's clearly a number of questions around the biases of criminal justice professionals toward the LGBT community, which of course we see at lots of places we go around the country. But just a number of questions about, do you know of places that you would really say have a strong coordinated community response when it comes to the LGBT community?
As far as citing places in particular, I cannot. I can speak to, New York's response as being about as good as it gets. And, you're going to find that in other major metropolitan areas, right, there's going to be a coordinated response. And so to look, perhaps what is best to do, right, is to look at the way those models have been set up. And what do those models look like, right? So in New York City, you have a number of different police officers who are assigned to make sure that police officers throughout the city are responding to the LGBT community correctly, right? So there's one police officer who reports directly to the mayor on the issue, and there's one police officer who reports to the commissioner, or there are a number who report to the commissioner on the issue. And then there's an entire task force of LGBT officers who are, supposed to look out for the proper treatment of LGBT people in the community, in the criminal justice, from the police realm. I know that Los Angeles has people on their police force who have similar responsibilities, and San Francisco as well has a tremendous presence in that area. And what I mean by look at, the way they are set up is, if you are living in a city or in a town or a state even that does not have these resources available, these are models for you to follow. These are models for you to recommend to the people that you speak to in meetings, and saying that, we've seen these problems and we need to get rid of them. For example, in New York, to address these problems, they're doing this. And maybe New York is not the best example because they'll roll their eyes at you, right? So, just do look to the way they've been structured so that you can think about ways to improve your own system or where to send people in general.
Yeah, I think that's well put, and I'll just echo that. I mean, one of the things we found at the San Diego Family Justice Center in the early years was that if we had gay and lesbian identified staff, we were much more likely to see the LGBT community show up for services if, one, there were people there that identified with their community providing services, and two, it was very clear that they were welcome and it was identified and discussed. And so I think identification of staff members in a collaborative that are serving the LGBT community is important. And the other thing that you may want to comment on is, I go a lot of places around the United States where they almost look at me with a blank stare when I talk about the gay and lesbian community and victims in same-sex relationships. And it causes me to often focus more on just challenging them to identify any resources that they might have in their community for same-sex relationships, because it's probably not going to come from that particular prosecutor's office or that particular police department or even that particular shelter. So that really trying to identify what entities there are in the community that they can reach out to when a victim comes forward for help is an important beginning of a change process, because there's a lot of hostility I see and homophobia and a lot of bias against people in same-sex relationships from the get-go when I walk into a community, particularly in the criminal justice system.
I think that's a very good point, right? And in preparing for this presentation, I had the conversation with a few people of, do you say, if you can't help, don't help, right? Do you say, if you have those biases, don't try and help at all? And part of preparing for a presentation, right, that is outside the bubble of New York that I work in, you have to realize that there are going to be situations in which you're going to walk into environments that are intensely homophobic. And in those types of environments, I think it is the responsibility of that environment not to necessarily identify themselves as homophobic, but to identify themselves as perhaps not being suited or prepared to deal with people who come in who are in same-sex relationships and who are having some sort of one problem or another, right? And in the first step after you identify that problem is to identify resources for those clients who come in, so that you can, send them out right away to someplace who can help them. And after that, I would say your second responsibility is to start training your staff.
Well, in an interesting sort of way, it's analogous. We started reaching out first to the faith community in San Diego. We found they had incredible biases against not just same-sex relationships, but against victims of domestic violence. And when we reached out to the faith community, we quickly realized that we couldn't just refer victims to the faith community for help. We had to identify people in the faith community that were willing to get educated and trained and work closely with us with respect for all of the faith beliefs that someone might bring with them, and that we didn't just try to say we're going to get the whole faith community to change tomorrow. We tried to identify individuals that could be service providers that could get educated and come alongside us in the process of trying to do social change over what is, takes time.
And I think that's a very good point, right? And almost to the point that if you are, if you're on this webinar right now and you can identify yourself as somebody who feels like you might be working in a homophobic environment and yet you want to help, you can start educating yourself. And you can start, figuring out the fact that you might be somebody who wants to help with this issue and be the change within your own organization.
Yeah, that's great. There's a number of questions I'll just kind of put out to you. There's a number of questions around kind of how do you think you can work with the media to identify, spread awareness about same-sex relationship issues. How have you had experience with that? How do you suggest doing that, particularly in diverse communities across the country? How do you really partner with the media on this? And is that a good place to start, or is that down the road for a lot of communities to reach out to the media to try to educate?
It depends upon the community, right, as to whether or not it's down the road or if the time is now. And the reason I think so, the reason I think that is because it is a difficult thing if you're going to introduce this topic into a community that is homophobic, let's say, right? Or if you're going to introduce this topic into any community that where there also is simultaneously perhaps a ballot initiative that deals with the recognition of same-sex marriage. Where I have run into trouble is that, amongst the LGBT population that does print news, right, or people who do print news about LGBT issues, there's not necessarily an impetus right now to print stories about the problems with LGBT relationships, right? There's more of a business of talking about how our relationships are just as wonderful as everybody else's. Much less of an impetus on pointing out how our relationships are just like everybody else's because they have domestic violence.
Yeah.
So, the big media juggernauts the big LGBT organizations that have lots of money and can get press are focused more on presenting things in a positive light. And, that might be where things need to be for this point in time. And perhaps within our own community of domestic violence providers, what we need to be doing is we need to be the public, the PR people within our organizations who are just introducing this aspect of domestic violence, right? This area of domestic violence to our organizations and into every conversation we have.
Yeah. There's a number of people who've asked you to talk a little bit more about questioning youth, queer youth, young people that are basically ending up trying to access services, but maybe their parents don't know they're gay. The issues that come up around bullying related to sexual orientation. And I don't know how much you've worked in the whole teen relationship violence area, but there's quite a number of questions about wanting you to talk a little bit more about how to offer services, how to educate, how to provide outreach.
Okay. Well, one thing is, right, you either identify the resources in your community that are LGBT focused, or you make it the mission of one of your staff members to really educate themselves on this topic, and to really make it a focus of having them reach out. And it might be farther than your own community, right? You might not have those resources in your community. So identifying someone on staff who can do this might require that they reach out, to people in New York or to people who've been doing this work in the other, places where it's been happening for a while, because they're the best equipped to train somebody on how to deal with, for this reason, queer and questioning youth. I think there are great organizations throughout the country that are dealing with youth who might be questioning and who might be being bullied. The Trevor Project is a national organization that has a 1-800 hotline for queer and questioning youth to call and basically talk about any problems they have, but they also will assess suicidality if necessary. GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, is very focused on not just the bullying issue, but the issue of, allowing diversity, inclusive conversations to happen in our schools, so that the concept of bullying is addressed at its very beginning. So there are organizations that are working on it. For the most part, they're sort of national, and they get the most attention in those same big metropolitan areas that have very high concentration of people who are living in same-sex relationships as well. Mm-hmm. But the push needs to be to getting the focus out everywhere, right? And getting it into those little communities where sometimes violence is just so pervasive towards this community.
Yeah, that's good. There's just a lot of questions, so I think people really appreciate the program and the presentation today, and I don't know in the last 5 minutes if we'll get to them all, but I'll try a few others. There are some questions around whether or not what family justice centers around the country are offering LGBT programs and services. You want to talk a little bit about New York, and then I'll talk about a few others?
Sure. So I'll talk specifically about New York, and in New York, I sit in the Bronx Family Justice Center. I also take cases of same-sex domestic violence throughout all the 5 boroughs. Family Justice Center in Brooklyn, which is located in downtown Brooklyn, has an attorney who sits there at least one day a week, who is dedicated to serving same-sex victims of domestic violence. And in Queens, there are attorneys from my organization, which is focused on this issue, and then also the Anti-Violence Project of New York City has started a domestic violence initiative, and they work in tandem with me up here in the Bronx. They work in Brooklyn as well, and whereas I'm focused on the legal piece, they have a social worker who is also a case manager who comes and will meet with clients for counseling services as well as case management services. So it really is, Family Justice Center is also focused in New York City at least, on making sure that all of their staff members have cultural competency training. Up here, they're done by somebody from Sanctuary for Families who serves the LGBT community for their organization, and that's given to all staff members as part of their core training, I believe, at every Family Justice Center in New York City.
Mm-hmm. That's good. And I do think, we, as the National Family Justice Center Alliance, we put out that challenge to family justice centers all over the country. I know in San Diego, we really had to reach out to the center here in Hillcrest that serves the LGBT community. And even though they weren't a full-time on-site partner, they became very much an off-site partner on an on-call basis. I think every family justice center should try to be identifying social services that relate to the LGBT community and trying to partner with them. Our experience has been to make very clear that our legal services are available to same-sex couples in the San Diego Family Justice Center. And when that word gets out, they, of course, are more likely to come for services when they know that they're available and they will be provided. But I will also just say, just like we've learned with heterosexual victims, when they're able to tell their story and we identify those that it's safe for them to talk, it's safe for them to share their experience. My dad always used to say a person with an experience is never at the mercy of a person with an argument. And when you hear the experience of someone that's gone through it and you get to talk to them face to face in a forum, in a training, the humanity of it has a great impact. Talking about statistics and trying to talk about biases in the abstract is very difficult. But when you have a real person in front of you and they're able to share their experience and how they were treated by law enforcement, how they were treated by the criminal or civil justice system, that often has a much stronger impact. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, but we've found that letting same-sex victims share their stories, and when it's safe for them to do so and they've got advocacy and support, that often is a great training tool.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think so in general, right? Because what I often say is that in this situation, it's between heterosexual couples and same-sex couples, it's about the uniformity of their experience, right? It's about both of them both those, victims in that situation identifying as victims of domestic violence and what that means, right, to both of them, and that it means very similar things. And when you hear it firsthand, and when you hear the actual accounts of DV, you begin to recognize, especially as practitioners in the field, the uniformity of that experience. And it takes the mystery away. It takes the obscurity away from the fact that they might be a gender identity or a sexual orientation that you're not all that well acquainted with. And it really puts the situation in a context that enables us to help as best we can.
There's a number of questions that have come up, number of comments about recent murders of transgendered persons that one of the representatives for the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs has texted in on the call that NCAVP reported 27 murders in the transgender community in 2010, the second highest rate ever recorded, and just kind of questioning that sharp increase, and probably related to transphobia, obviously related to the economy and the impacts that we're seeing with murder-suicides and other crimes. But I just wanted to note that and note your comments about other national organizations that are doing such great work around all of this. There are questions, too, Ted, that I don't know the answer to, that we need to probably get the answers, and we can put them out as a follow-up to this webinar. Are there LGBT-focused domestic violence or batterer intervention programs around the country? I know that Ulster Douglas has done some amazing work in Atlanta, Georgia, around the LGBT community, but I'm not familiar with batterers programs that have any great reach around the country focused on same-sex relationships. Are you?
Batterers programs? No, I am not at all.
And then a number of questions around whether or not there's any specific risk assessment tool for assessing risk in same-sex relationships that takes into account certain issues in same-sex relationships that the typical tools like Mosaic and the danger assessment by Dr. Jackie Campbell, whether there's anything specifically focused on the LGBT community. I'm not aware of anything, but if you are or if others are, we'd sure love to hear about them so we can put out that information.
I do think NCAVP has recommendations for questions that should be asked, and I think the Northwest Network has also, put out some materials on that as well. I would recommend, though, that rather than just referring to materials, that you get somebody in to also do a training around the risk assessment as well.
Well, thank you very much. Ted, this was a great presentation. I so appreciate the power of your articulation of these issues and your expertise and your skills. It's interesting, we got a number of comments after I just said a person with an experience is never at the mercy of a person with an argument. You have both. You have your own experience and you have your argument and you have your ability to really sensitively address these issues, and I really respect you and appreciate your challenges to us and this information. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up. We've come to the end of our time, but Ted Farley, staff attorney and LGBTQ initiative coordinator for the Domestic Violence Project at the Urban Justice Center, thank you for your presentation. Great job today.
Thank you so much.
As we wrap up our session, I want to thank Ted for doing such a great job. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions, but feel free to follow up with us. We can forward those questions on to Ted. If you have other resources, we'd be happy to post them at familyjusticecenter.org or .com. Ted will be speaking at our conference this next April in New Orleans, Louisiana. The dates of that conference are April 17 to 19. We just posted registration for the conference on our website at familyjusticecenter.org or .com. We often encourage communities to send teams to that conference so that they come back with a real multidisciplinary view of collaboration and coordinated community response. We'd love to see you all joining us next April, not only to hear Ted Farley, but to hear many others from the national domestic violence and sexual assault world that will be speaking. We've got invitations out to Attorney General Eric Holder and Vice President Joe Biden, Lynn Rosenthal from the White House, OVW Director Sue Carbon, and we're looking forward to just having a great week in New Orleans, April 17 to 19 this next year. I want to thank you for joining today's presentation. As I mentioned, this presentation will be available on our website for free if you want to pass on that information to others. It has been recorded, both the PowerPoint and Ted Farley's audio presentation, and you can access that information at www.familyjusticecenter.org or .com. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ted. Great job. We're so honored to have you work with us, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It usually takes like a few extra seconds to stop actually recording. Lots of questions.